Welcome to the Learn By podcast. I'm Valentina.
And I'm Renee.
And together we talk about practical tips and tools for teachers around formative action and other effective pedagogy. We try to keep it short
and brief.
Anything we mention you can find in the show notes. Want to know more about what we do? Check out our website, formativeaction.com, where you can find our book, blogs, and online courses.
Hello and welcome to the Learn Bites podcast. In this episode, we will be continuing our discussion on feedback that we started in our previous episode. And this time we will be talking about how you can organize feedback in your lessons. So in the previous episode, we discussed that it was very important to make your students think and then do something with what they have thought about. And that is the essence of effective feedback. In this episode, we will be discussing different ways how to organize feedback. Valentina, can you tell me what ways we will be discussing that you can use as a teacher to organize your feedback?
Yes, there are actually a lot of very effective working methods that how you can organize feedback, but we're going to discuss, I think, the most common ones or maybe the most easy ones to use. And they all the different working methods are based on the same principles. So they're all are based on that your students have to think hard, that they have to do something with it, and that you promote your students to become more independent. So that's really the main goal here with organizing feedback in different forms. And as we discussed also in the previous podcast, that it's key to think which form fits best at which moment in the learning process, because you want to stimulate independence. So maybe some form does is more difficult for your students, so they have to be more independent in that working method of feedback. So we're going to talk about whole class feedback, feedback through exemplars, peer feedback, audio feedback, and inner feedback.
So, and these are all ways of giving feedback where you don't necessarily are the giver of the feedback, right?
Yes, because we want our students to become more independent. Okay, so the first one. We're going to talk about whole class feedback. Renee, why is that such a good working method to use if you want to organize feedback?
Well, usually when you make your students do a certain task, like writing an essay, they will all make sort of the same mistakes. So they will struggle with structure or struggle with a good summary, or they will make the same interpunction mistakes. And you can, instead of giving everybody personalized feedback on the same mistakes that everybody made, you can just give broad feedback to the entire class. And you'll just say, well, I noticed, some common strengths and weaknesses, and you did this very well, or the most of you did this very well. And this is something you all struggled with. You struggled with interpunction, and you might show an example of what that looked like in somebody's work. And I think the positive side of this is that it's less personal. So if your teacher says to you, well, these are your strengths and weaknesses, it'll feel really personal, and it might be hard for you as a student then, because you have such a negative reaction, is to turn that into action. And if it's like feedback to the entire class, then you need to think about, well, is this something that applies to me? And if so, how can I sort of adapt that feedback to turn it into an action plan for my own work?
Yeah, exactly. And there's, of course, also a risk here that I think lots of teachers will immediately think about, is that if we organize whole class feedback, that there may be also a couple students who will think, well, this doesn't apply to me. And we really don't like that as a teacher, because that's not the point here, and that's not what we want to create. So you can safeguard that with maybe a feedback log. So then you will ask your students to reflect on the different feedback processes that you organize, and maybe then you will ask your students like, okay, you got whole class feedback now, write down in your log which of the aspects of the whole class feedback do you think are applicable to your own work, and you should also give arguments to when you think that some of the aspects do not apply to your work, and why not then. So then you will make sure, or make more sure, that your students really need to think hard again, and also make sure that they put the feedback into action. That's what I really love about the feedback log.
Yeah. So the important thing is, of course, is when you use this type of organizing feedback, is that you make sure there's also a landing space. So you talk to them about common strengths and weaknesses. Maybe you show an example. They think about how that applies to their work. You ask them to make it explicit through a feedback log, but then, of course, students need to put that into action, and so that you can see what happened inside their heads. Were they actually able to improve their work based on the whole class feedback?
Yeah, you have to make sure that you give them a new example, or that they should rewrite the essay or improve the essay, so that you can really see. Yeah, I actually have a memory of when I got whole class feedback myself. And it was a really interesting memory, because I didn't like the process at all, actually. So I find it I find it a really horrid experience, but I learned a lot. So it was during my master's, and we were writing on our thesis, and we should then the teacher, we all made our drafts, we delivered our first drafts of our thesis, and then the teacher picked out one of the drafts of the other students, and then she put it on the main screen, and she walked through the whole essay, the whole thesis, and she pointed out which aspects were really excellent and main things that this particular student had to work on. And I remember feeling really frustrated and disappointed, because I was thinking like, why am I not getting all this feedback? Because now my other student knows really well what she needs to improve and what was already quite excellent of her work. And I need to do all that thinking by myself. I remember feeling frustrated, but I learned so much, because at the same time, I put on my laptop and put on my own thesis at my screen, and remember looking very closely to the main screen and listening really hard to what my teacher was saying, and then looking at my own work again and thinking, okay, how does this apply to my work then? So I remember that during the frustration, I also was really thinking hard and very critically about my own work and what I needed to do to improve it. So I think that it's very important also to recognize as teachers that this process can be quite frustrating for your students, but it's good to do it anyway, because they will learn a lot and they will become more independent during this process.
So that's actually a very interesting example that you gave, Valentina. And your teacher could probably have improved on the practice by showing 2 examples on their screen. So in that way, you as a student in the classroom could then compare those 2 examples and then make your own conclusions about what could be improved. So in your example, there was just one example, and the teacher was talking it through, like these are the things that are good or strong or weak about it. And if the teacher would have shown 2 examples, you could have compared them and then made up your own mind on what was strong and weak. And we know from research done by David Nichol is that you actually can give yourself way more feedback by comparing exemplars than if a teacher had told you the feedback.
Yeah, and I also really find very interesting of the work of David is that you can also use different kinds of exemplars. That may be the first thing that comes to mind. So if your students are writing an essay, of course, you can show other essays as a different exemplars, but you can also maybe then use a different type of exemplar. So maybe a news article or a podcast that also is about the topic that they are writing And then that different example can also create a lot of feedback for the students. So it's a very interesting thought here to use the organize feedback through exemplars, and the examples don't really necessarily have to be the same type of work that your students are producing.
So what we also know is that comparing them is not enough. And what you also need to ask from your students is to make explicit what they learned from studying the examples. And they could study the examples in pairs, but even if they study them alone, it's very important is that they make explicit what conclusions they drew, because otherwise it'll be some students might not make good enough use of comparing the examples.
Yeah, and I think the bonus effect that's also coming into play here is that by comparing the different examples, that it's also adding to the sense of quality of your students. So they will get a better grasp of what quality really looks like. And at the same time, it's also beneficial for their self-regulational skills, because they will be better at grasping the concept of quality, and then they will also become better at monitoring their own process and having a clearer view on their own quality of their own work and knowing better what they have to do next.
Yeah, so in the previous episode on Sense for Quality, which was episode 2, we discussed that it's always wise to start by developing a sense for quality before you engage in a feedback process. But, you don't have to stop showing exemplars. When you've started the feedback process, you can actually employ exemplars again or other exemplars when you've started organizing the feedback process in order to develop more inner feedback for your students. So the next approach for organizing feedback would be peer feedback. But with peer feedback, there's like an elephant in the room, is that students and teachers always hate it.
I agree. Yeah, I hated it because it doesn't feel effective. It is a very horrid experience because
for everybody
involved. So most of the time the students hate it, but you hate it as a teacher because you're very unsatisfied with the quality of the feedback that the students give to each other.
Yeah, they'll focus on the wrong thing, say the wrong thing.
Yeah, they will say stuff like, yeah, dude, looks great. And or keep on the good work, or this is horrible, do it again. And then the students will feel in every way frustrated and would not provide better work afterwards.
Yeah, so the first way to improve on peer feedback is by developing a sense for quality, of course, right? So that's already something that you can do. But it's also useful to think about what makes peer feedback effective. And I believe is that one of the reasons it works so well is actually because students hate it. If they just get feedback from you, then they will just, they trust the source and they'll be like, well, this is the feedback that the teacher gave to me, so it must be correct. And they'll think less about it, right? It won't engage them in thinking like peer feedback would. Because with peer feedback, you just don't trust the source. Like you look at your fellow students and you're like, these people understand it. They're stupid. They don't understand the thing. What will happen is that will make you check whether that feedback is correct. You have to think about, does this make sense? Is it useful? And then maybe you look something up in your book or on the internet and you're like, well, I'm not sure. So, and that all those activities will make sure is that you learn more from the feedback that you have received, although it's more work, of course. So, that's one side of the story. And the other side of the story is that by giving feedback to another student, you stimulate your own learning. Usually by looking at the work that someone else did, you will also generate generate ideas on how you can improve your own work.
Yeah, so the thing here is, and I find it always very fascinating, is that the giver actually learns more than the receiver. So it's the other way around as what you would think how it would work. So the giver of feedback learns actually more than the receiver of peer feedback, because the reason, as you just said. And how I also like to scaffold or support organizing peer feedback is by creating focus, because that's what students most of the time find also very difficult. Like if they have to give peer feedback to each other, is what to focus on. So most of the time they will focus on the wrong things, like, yeah, this looks very beautiful, or this looks very nice, and that's not like a very important aspect of the work that students actually made. So providing focus is a really key thing here, and I would promote using a single point rubric, because that's really focused on like a couple of criteria, not too much, or maybe even just one, and it also helps with organizing the landing space. It helps with putting the feedback into action, because like the rubric has room for, okay, what is already good or excellent in the work, and what needs to improve. And in that blank space, you will then write what needs to be done. So it really helps putting the peer feedback into action.
Yeah, I actually think that single point rubric is usually just a very confusing term, because, when you look at examples of single point rubrics, they usually have more than one point.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so it's like, where did this term come from? But if you stick to like how they were intended, then usually you would put in one criterion. And it'd be like, well, that is the single point that we're going to look at. For example, the text structure, or the opening sentence, or like the summary that you made. And that will help students get more focus in their feedback and know what they're looking for, but also to make the feedback more focused that they give to another student.
Yeah, and if you're still afraid that it will not work, then you can also try to organize the peer feedback anonymously. So if you're too afraid that the peers or the students will don't not trust their peers and the feedback that they will provide, and then they will not take it into account, then you can maybe think of organizing it anonymously, so then they won't know which of their peers have given him or her the feedback.
So, and the next thing that we're going to discuss is one of my favorites. It's audio feedback.
Why is it your favorite?
Because it's a more personal way to give feedback. If I, for example, if I would give you feedback, Valentina, and I would write you an email discussing the strengths and weaknesses in something that you wrote, then it might come across as being a bit harsh. While if I were to send you a voice memo with the strengths and weaknesses, then you can hear the tone in my voice, and it will, depending on the tone of voice I have, you can tell whether it's like well intended or like aggressive or like, but you can get a better sense of what the message that I'm trying to convey, and what state I'm in when giving you feedback. And that's actually very hard to judge if you receive written feedback.
Yeah, it leaves less room for your own interpretation. And we all have like a critical voice inside, ready to be very critical about your work. So we all have experience of written feedback, and that you interpreted it way more critically than maybe the writer intended. And actually, we can talk about this from own experience, Renee, because we both write blogs a lot, and I have written a blog in the past and emailed it to you, and you sent me back a voice memo. And I remember actually like listening to it like for 6 or maybe 10 times, and have to think really hard on the points and aspects that you put into words in your voice memo. So for me as the receiver, it was quite a big deal because I have to listen to it, pause it, look at my work again, trying to improve it, then check it again to see if I didn't forget or miss out on different aspects that you told me in the voice memo. And then I listened to it again as a whole to see what other aspects you were saying. So, and I remember also feeling really positive about it because, again, as you just said, you can hear the tone of voice, and it feels very personal. But at the same time, you as a receiver have to work pretty hard to put it into action. And for you as a giver, how it doesn't take you that much time, right?
No, it takes less time. Yeah, and I think your experience will be mirrored by that of students, is that they will feel it's more work, right? So you have to listen, and then you have to summarize for yourself what's that person saying. You have to take notes. You have to go back to your own work. Oh, really? What is he referring to? And that thinking will actually, that's important for learning. So, and that's the kind of thinking that you might want to generate in your students as well, in order for them to make a solid improvement to their work. And I think another option could also be is that you give video feedback, is where you supplement the audio with video, and you go through like something a student did, and you will like make suggestions or comments on it in the document itself, but then they can hear your voice and maybe also see your face when you're giving the feedback, and which will give them a better impression of what you were the message that you were intending to convey, instead of somebody trying to fill in the blanks when it's written feedback.
Yeah, and I think video feedback, it works perfectly for like very large documents, because then you can also flip through the screen and talk through the work of the students. So it doesn't take you so much time, but at the same time, it can be a very good learning experience for the student.
And the final way that you could organize feedback that we will be discussing is like the teacher lazy mode form of feedback.
Teacher lazy mode? Okay, now you got people listening, Renee. Tell us more.
Well, it's self-feedback by students. So, so you let students give themselves feedback on the work that they did. And that's like super easy for you as a teacher, because you don't have to do anything really. And you just make them responsible for giving themselves feedback. And I'm sort of jesting about this, but there is a sense of reality to it, in that you'd expect your students at the end of a learning journey to be able to give themselves feedback on how they did. And there's also research that shows that not giving students feedback, but putting them in the position to give themselves feedback, actually benefits a number of students, and usually the students that were able to give themselves feedback. So getting yourself out of the equation and just letting them generate feedback for themselves, for example, through like by using examples or exemplars or guided questions, or whatever way you would want to approach it. It makes your students think more when they have the capacity to do so.
Yeah, so I think it's, again, good to think about with this form, because I really love this working method of giving yourself feedback, but you shouldn't do this in like the beginning of the learning journey or the learning process. So not with the first draft or the first thing that they produced, because then it will be way too difficult, because they have to be way too independent to do this feedback form with good quality. So I really love this form, but I think it's crucial here to put it in the end of the lesson series or the learning process, when your students are really up for it. And then it's a perfect way, because it's just like you said, it's not much work for you, and it really fits well with creating more independent learners.
So here are some questions to make you reflect if you understood the key concepts of this episode. Why do students and teachers hate peer feedback?
What are the benefits of whole class feedback?
Why does whole class feedback feel more safe?
What are the bonus effects of feedback through exemplars?
Why would it be beneficial to give peer feedback anonymously?
How can you support organizing peer feedback?
What are the benefits of providing audio feedback?
When in the learning process is organizing self-feedback a good idea? Thank you for listening.